Sandra Heiler, is an early American historian who specializes in the years leading up to the American Revolution through the early federal period. She's currently treasurer of Montgomery Preservation Incorporated. She's a member of the Rustic Roads Advisory Committee, as well as a member of Montgomery History's Speakers Bureau. She has a BA in mathematics and an MA in American Studies and Historic Preservation from Boston University. An unlikely backstory is that she spent 38 years as a computer scientist in her previous life, which is very interesting. But we are fortunate to have her here. And the only thing I will say before I ask Sandra to come up is if you haven't gotten the brochure, we have some in the back you can get before you leave, but it gives a lot more documentation and details about what she's going to share with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So this, in June of 1774, 10 men from Lower Frederick County, which is what Montgomery County became the official name of that area in 1776. They met at a tavern in a place that didn't exist yet, but it became Rockville. It was actually at the intersection of two roads, the Frederick Road and Beers Mill Road. And they met there to sign resolves that promised to boycott all trade with Britain, all imports and all exports. And they start with an interesting line that says, "The town of Boston is suffering in the common cause of all America." I've called this Becoming Americans because in a period of just a little over a decade, these men and men from all over Maryland and all over all of the 13 colonies had gone from feeling like they were loyal subjects of Britain. They are Englishmen who are entitled to all of the grants, or excuse me, all of the rights that are guaranteed by the Magna Carta. In the English Civil War, excuse me, English Civil Law, and they've become advocates for America and a colony that they've probably never been to. It's totally unlikely that any of these 10 men had ever set foot in Boston, much less anyplace else. They were local because there weren't any roads around. Okay, the background print on this is a print from Benjamin Franklin, who published this as the cartoon that he published in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, during the French and Indian War. It was revived in 1774 by Paul Revere, who used it as the masthead on his newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy. And then it appeared everywhere on newspapers all over the 13 colonies during the Revolution. I put the year 1774 because it was really a pivotal year in this build up to revolution and ultimately to independence. It's often referred to as the long year of 1774 because it really began in the late fall of 1773 when the East India Company shipped boatloads of tea to 4 ports, including Boston, and we know what happened to the tea there. And it really ended after midnight on December 31st of 1774, it ended in Lexington and Concord. So the original 13 colonies, and they're marked here, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts, so it was considered part of that particular colony. The area of the 13 colonies all put together was about 4 times the size of all of Great Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales combined. The population by the middle of the 18th century was just about 1.5 million, and that was whites, blacks, and Native Americans living in the 13 colonies. So it's about a quarter of the size of Britain. The colonies themselves were, almost everyone lived on a farm. There were 6 cities that approached 20,000 people, but the colonies were really undeveloped. There were huge forests which were ripe for lumbering. There were the big swamps, the Dismal Swamp, where Washington and Franklin and Jefferson were all claiming land. There were mountains, but mostly it was undeveloped with almost no roads. Um, it was extremely difficult to get from one colony to another, and people didn't bother. Who cares? Um, there was one post road, but overall, if you wanted to go from, say, Boston to Philadelphia, you'd take a stagecoach, and it took about 2.5 weeks, depending on the weather. If you were really lucky, because there's no travel at night, because there's no artificial lighting. So anyway, Britain itself was highly industrialized at the time. So with 4 times the population in this small place that's filled with factories and people turning out finished products. So the colonies, and I can't emphasize this enough, the colonies are completely different from each other, and they have very little interaction among them. So the climate is obviously different, and so what they can produce is very different going from colony to colony. Everybody has a combination of a local government and a royal governor. But the local governments in all but New England, they're appointed by the royal governor. So you can elect people, but they've either been already appointed or the slate of candidates has been decided by the royal governor. And then you can vote for them, but you don't have a lot of choice. New England has a very different sort of government. It's by the Massachusetts Charter says that the government will be by town meeting. And everybody can vote at a town meeting. Everyone gets a chance to talk, and the town meeting will go on until everybody who wants to speak can. So there were rules of decorum. You can't attack people. You can't use vulgarity. You can't hog the floor. But New England gets an A in democracy. They get an F in freedom of conscience because they were, during the whole 17th century, they were, hanging Quakers, for example. It was freedom of religion as long as you are in the beginning of Puritan. Later, you can be an Anglican too. We won't hang you for being an Anglican, but don't, Baptists, send them to Rhode Island. Maybe the Indians won't kill them, and maybe they will. So it's a totally different government, and of course, then different laws as you went from colony to colony. They have different religions, and the religions in some places it's a state religion, and it has to be supported by local taxes. In other places, there's more freedom. Like Pennsylvania was established for freedom of religion, and they specifically invited people from places where they had been tormented for their religious feelings. So Pennsylvania, we know it's full of Quakers, but it also invited German Catholics because they were persecuted in Germany. So the religion made a huge difference in their feelings towards the mother country and towards each other. The religion plays an enormous role in everyone's life, and when you live in a Puritan colony, that makes you behave in a certain way. When you're in an Anglican colony, it's different. Maryland has the reputation of allowing and welcoming Catholics. They did for a very short time. When the second Lord Baltimore was put in charge, then, and he was a Catholic, they changed the law. We'll allow Catholics, and they're welcome here. When his reign is over, then we don't want Catholics. And in fact, Protestants were killing Catholics in places like Kent Island. So this was not that welcoming a place. The religion was really, there's a lot of bias everywhere except Pennsylvania. Slavery was legal in every colony. And I want you to just look at the statistics because you can see attitudes vary from the it's 2% of people of the total population are enslaved in Massachusetts. There, in Virginia, 50% of the total population is enslaved. So there's huge differences in attitude. A lot of that is because you're growing tobacco in Virginia. Of course, you need a lot of slaves to make a lot of money, and you're, you know, hunting. You're bringing in furs or growing timber and lumbering timber in Massachusetts, and so you can afford to be egalitarian in Massachusetts. The biggest change in what's relevant to what's happening with respect to the mother country is in commerce. So every colony printed its own paper currency, and you could only use the paper currency in that colony. If you traveled for some reason, but God knows why you would bother, to another colony, you had to use the coinage because the coinage is silver, and they will not take colonial Massachusetts currency or Maryland currency. New England was highly mechanized, and the rum industry was one of the major industries, and so New England was bringing in sugar, turning it into molasses to make rum. Sugar was taxed, so of course smuggling was rampant all over New England. There's far less reason to smuggle anything when you live in Maryland or Virginia or South Carolina. The Mid-Atlantic was producing farm products, so tobacco was the main one. Also, as you went a little bit farther south, they were producing rice. There was really no cotton yet. That came later because you couldn't make any money on cotton. They negotiated all the trade agreements with Britain separately, and they're very often in competition with each other. So people from Rhode Island are in competition with people from Massachusetts in selling the big logs that you make ship's masts out of. In Maryland and Virginia were always in competition for the contracts for shipping tobacco. There's almost no intercolonial trade, as I mentioned. And the colonies themselves, the 13 colonies, are much more like small independent countries that are in competition with each other, and they have common borders, but they're out for themselves, and there is simply no push for, we're all in this together. They weren't all in this together. It's a great discovery for them when they find, well, we are all Americans, and this is going to make a big difference during the years leading up to 1776. There were things that made it all feasible. These were the few commonalities that they had. First, all of the colonies are part of the same postal system. And there is a post road that runs, it connects, it runs from Portland, Maine, which was at the time really Falmouth, Massachusetts, but its name changed. And it ran all the way to Savannah, Georgia, and it extended to Quebec in the north and to St. Augustine, which are outside of the colonies. The other thing about it was that it's connected to the British postal system. So mail from the continent and from Britain you can easily pass that. It took about a month and a half to cross the Atlantic, but the postal system is one of the few things that ties the colonies together. Communication is way better than travel. They also had newspapers. By 1750, there were 24 weekly newspapers in the colonies, and every colony had at least one newspaper that was produced there. And the newspapers were carried by the postal system. That was the primary reason for building a postal system. Benjamin Franklin was the Postmaster General, and he owned the biggest newspaper in the colonies, the Pennsylvania Gazette. And so, of course, he's going to support the building of a post road. And the powers that be were quite aware that you cannot really run even the colonies without people knowing what's going on. So that in the newspaper editor in one place would write the stories about the local news. Those newspapers then are passed to other newspapers. At the time that to send a letter, it was ran between 6 and 25 cents, depending on how far it had to travel. You could send a newspaper anywhere within 100 miles for a cent and a, excuse me, for 1 cent, and you could send it anywhere for a cent and a half. And it was free to send a newspaper to the editor of another newspaper. And this is, you have no reporters, but this is how news is passed. So when an editor gets newspapers from someplace else, those stories are reprinted, and now they become national news, as if there were a nation. There wasn't. And when they get news from Britain, it includes news from the continent. And so newspapers have a combination of local, national, and international news. So people know what's going on, but they don't visit. They all have limited self-government, as I mentioned. Everybody has a royal governor, and then in New England, they also have open elections for selectmen. Every place else, they at least have some kind of election, but it's generally from whoever the royal governor has nominated. Another thing that does connect them is that they all view themselves as Englishmen and women. And so they have certain rights, particularly things like the right to a trial by a jury of your peers. The rights are guaranteed because they're English citizens, and so they have the rights that are defined in the Magna Carta and English civil law. And they're protected from foreign invasion, of course, by the most powerful army and navy on earth. People are very proud of the fact that they're English settlements or English colonies. They're not French or Spanish colonies where people have no rights. And so in that sense, it's good to be in an English colony, and there's just no downside so far. The big thing that connects everyone is that every colony is an integral part of the English economy through Atlantic trade. The colonies themselves are land rich and labor poor. So they're able to produce food and raw materials for all those factories. In Britain, they produce the fuel, all the lumber, the furs they can ship in. Britain itself is industrial. It's filled with a highly skilled workforce. However, there's not enough farmland to feed the whole population, and it's almost deforested. So fuel is a serious problem. Without the American colonies shipping food, of course, they can't feed the whole population of people and animals. The whole system is beneficial to both sides. Everybody benefits from this combination of, so that Britain is getting raw materials, food and fuel, and the American colonies have access then to finished products. So, they can get tea, for example. They can't grow tea themselves. They're getting all of these products coming from Britain, and they actually have access to the trade in the West Indies. And so it benefits everybody. It's advantageous to everybody, except, of course, for the odious traffic in human beings, which is indicated on this map by the arrows to and from Africa. In New England, they're pushing for end that awful trade. And in the mid-Atlantic and the South, they're pushing for never over our dead bodies will you end slavery. This is what keeps us going. The other thing about this is that by the middle of the 18th century, even substantially earlier, Britain had a very sophisticated banking system. So the entire thing is run on credit. They use bills of exchange. And in fact, Britain's trade with the continent, and the trade everywhere, is based on bills of exchange, so that a farmer in Maryland could order an iron plow, use it all summer, produce his crop, sell the crop to England, get paid for that, and then pay for the plow. So it benefits everybody to be able to have credit to do all this. So this is the most important products, and I've underlined tobacco merely because it's the main product coming out of Maryland. You can see that these are raw materials in their food, especially New England makes most of its money. They're doing furs, but cod, salt cod and smoked cod is an enormous export from New England, and Britain is living on it. So this is a picture. Everything in this picture is actually something that was imported into the colonies during this period. And you can see these are luxury products mostly. Some of them are tools. Guns. People are not making guns here because it doesn't make sense to make them. So the trade works because, number one, the products coming out from England are cheaper than they could possibly be made here because of the economies of scale. The second reason that there's such a lot of purchases, they're higher quality because of specialization. So, a potter in Baltimore can throw a clay pot. In a factory in Britain has people who specialize in firing at exactly the right temperature, in decorating and glazing and monogramming. There's no comparison. And it's going to end up at least as cheap and probably cheaper to buy your ceramics from England. It all works that way. And there's a little bit of status included with by getting all your stuff. This is the right stuff when you're getting it from England. It's not like the guy down the street who can make something for you. The other thing that makes this all work well is that rich people buy the same things as poor people. Poor people just buy fewer of them. So when John Hancock, for example, can order a 100-piece set of table or dinnerware that's monogrammed and gilded, a guy in Hagerstown can buy 2 teacups. They come from the same factory or the factory across the street. So the other thing is that you don't have to make specialized products for the northern trade and the southern trade. Women in New York were wearing dresses made out of the same very elegantly printed linen as women in South Carolina. So it's all to the benefit of the English manufacturers, and it's to the benefit of the buyers in the colonies, and they have something that England needs, which is the food and raw materials. So all this went beautifully until 1754 with the declaration of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was fought on 2 fronts all over Europe and in North America. This is a war between Britain and her allies and France and her allies. And in North America, Britain has a small number of Indian tribes that are allied with them. The French have a very large number of Indian tribes. So this is why it's called the French and Indian War. The French and Indians are the enemy. So when it opens, Britain sends 20,000 British regulars, highly skilled soldiers, full-time soldiers, to the colonies to fight this, and they're paying for it. Many of these soldiers brought their wives and children with them. And the colonies themselves raised an army of another 20,000 full-time soldiers. These are not militiamen. These are full-time soldiers. They're called, I forget what they're called. But anyway, but they are provincials. To distinguish them, they're not nearly as skilled as the British soldiers, but they serve in the role of support. And then the colonies are paying out of their own money to support those 20,000 provincials. They also raise another probably 6,000 non-combatants, some of them highly skilled, but people who are expert in supply lines, join in this. So, and then, the unskilled who they're the people who clear the forests that cover the Appalachian Mountains so that the British can get to where the battles are being done. They are the people who create the roads so the British can move the heavy armaments to the battles. They are all paid for by local colonial taxes that are collected by the governments of the colonies. So despite the British lost about 13,000 people among the regulars, and the provincials lost another 10,000, which is substantial, but it doesn't wipe out the population. Overall, the British and the provincials won the French and Indian War. There's no question about that. It was a huge military success. It almost doubled Britain's territories in North America. So this whole pig area is British territory now. Everything, the French ceded all of their territories in North America. And then the Spanish had been on the side of the French. They were allied with them. They didn't have much to do with the war, but they ceded Florida, which had been Spanish. At the very same time, Britain won the war in Europe, and in 1763, they signed the Treaty of Paris that ended the war on both fronts. So Britain is very clear to Britain, though, this war cost a lot of money, and it was all borrowed money. And they realized they cannot afford another Indian war. And so they established what they call the Proclamation Line. This is based on a treaty between Britain and the Indian tribes, and it doesn't include anybody from the colonies in deciding this. But the line runs all the way, the red line is the Proclamation Line, and it says that there could be no colonial settlement to the west of that line. And people who are already there need to return. Definitely no one buying land or taking land that they expect to then be able to sell, which includes George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who've already claimed this. They have to give that up. And Britain then will provide troops stationed in North America at great expense to prevent that settlement. You can imagine the resentment that, these colonies who had been just pleased as punch to be British citizens are now feeling like, we need to expand. We need to move west. What are you trying to do? And so would-be settlers and land agents especially are furious about this. So this wonderful military victory is also a financial disaster in Britain. It's borrowed money, British debt almost doubled as a result of this. And just about half of the income in Britain goes towards servicing the debt. The first thing they do is to put huge taxes on British citizens in Britain. This is the British natives in that country already paid about 4 times what the colonists paid in taxes, and now it's been increased enormously. The need for money is even worse because they have to keep troops to the west of the population line to keep colonists from invading Indian land. So during the war, there were some companies did very well. Textile companies did exceedingly well because they need all these textiles for tents and uniforms. The firearms industry did extremely well during the war. Other companies, ceramics went out of business. Book printers went out of business. So there was tremendous division within the commercial world in Britain about who was okay and who was done in by this whole war. So, and because of this whole thing, when it ended, so the textile industry, now it's not producing all this stuff for the war. The firearms people aren't doing it, and these other companies have gone out of business. So all of the luxury goods, the silvers, that kind of stuff that had flourished before the war, suffered during the war. Now they're out of business. There's tremendous amount of unemployment. And with that, because they don't have enough money to buy food from the colonies, then there's widespread hunger, there's bankruptcies, there's poverty all over the place. And in 1763, Britain went into a very deep recession. The recession also hit the colonies, but not nearly to the same extent that it hit Britain itself, because number one, they're much more resilient. They're not going to run out of food. They have food and fuel, and so this is just an aside. But the statistics that compare the British regulars and the provincials, the soldiers, showed that the provincial soldiers were on average almost 2 inches taller than the British soldiers. And it's almost certainly because of much better nutrition. Britain was not a healthy place to live. Getting enough food was a problem. And it's an highly industrialized society. People working on farms and hunting for furs and eating a better diet are just healthier. The other thing that happened, that as their troops left, then there was a problem in the colonies that all those people who were supporting the British troops with food and helping with laundry, all of that kind of stuff, lost business. But there simply is not the same kind of deep recession. It's a much milder recession that's happening in the colonies. That's why I included these two pictures of the port of Boston. So traffic was reduced. There's far less trade, but it's not wiped out. Bostonians are still buying sugar from the sugar islands and turning it into molasses so they can make rum and export it. And also, the colonists are able to substitute for the things that they can't afford or they can't get. Things like they can use honey instead of sugar. The people decided, well, we'll weave our own. Colonial women decided that we're not above spinning and weaving. We can do that. Much more likely, they said, well, we'll just keep patching our dresses because we don't, we're not going to be able to buy those British dresses, but we would not wear homespun because that's for slaves. It's itchy and unpleasant. Okay, and so one of the biggest things that happened that had no impact on New England was that tobacco prices plummeted. And so in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, of course, this has an enormous effect afterward. And so the farmers who were able to switch to grain because it was still possible, even with poor soil, to switch to grain. And, there was an excess of slaves. So in these colonies, because you need a lot of slaves if you're growing tobacco, you don't need as many. And so that's a big upset. What do we do with all these slaves? We'll free them. They're on their own and they can't survive. So in all ways, though, you can view it as a mild recession in the colonies. It had been a disaster in Britain. So the first thing Britain, and they've taxed their own citizens as much as they can possibly squeeze out of them, and they can't get any more, and they're in the middle of this recession. And so Parliament decides we've got to tax the colonies. They're British colonies. We have the ability to tax them. We already have a tax on sugar. It's not very much. They passed the Sugar Act in 1764. It's a tiny impact on the price of sugar, but smuggling is rampant. And so what this is mainly is it's a new regulatory policy. They send agents to every one of the ports to watch for smuggling, which is greatly resented by the locals there who are engaged in smuggling especially. But the other thing they did was to say, this is the one crime, smuggling, that we will not allow colonial juries to be, to decide them. This is the one crime that has to be tried in royal courts. The closest royal court is in Halifax. This is the first time that Britain now is taking away a constitutional right. And we all know what happens when people lose a constitutional right that they've depended on. And so what happens is that there are widespread complaints and demonstrations. And New England, which has always had a kind of a touch and go relationship with Britain, has the most violent of these demonstrations. But they're still, they're hanging people in effigy. Part of that is that the people who founded New England and through the whole 17th century, they're Puritans. And the English Civil War was a war between what we call the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers are in support of the king, and the Roundheads, they're called that because they have these round helmets, are Puritans. Cromwell is a Puritan. And they won. They decapitated the king. They went for quite a long time with no king. Ultimately, the king is replaced by James, I think James II, some James. Anyway, but there is that whole Puritan background makes the New Englanders especially it's a touchier relationship with the mother country. The other thing that had happened was that when Massachusetts and Connecticut were formed, they had a contract with Britain, which said that they were entirely responsible for their own voting for the local government. So the royal governor had no say in who is elected to the local government. And this is what I had mentioned before. It's a town meeting with elected selectmen. And during the 1670s, Britain tried to take that back. And so you can imagine now it's the whole contract that the colony has with Britain, which is about to try to change the basis of the local government. And New Englanders fought it and they won. That was not changed, but it just left this really bad feeling between the New Englanders. And so they will continue to be the most radical, the first people who start complaining, this should be a war. We don't just want them to correct these taxes. And the taxation without representation is a thing that came from New England in the 17th century. It represents, they're taxing us, we're paying the sugar tax. They're really trying to interfere with our way of life. And the representation, we have not any representation in Parliament. This is, everybody knows that the authority of the government derives from the consent of the governed. And this is showing they're trying to change this here. So anyway, so these were demonstrations. This is a picture of the demonstration in New York. They were small demonstrations sprinkled throughout the colonies, but the big ones were in New York, where there are a lot of Puritans who had settled on Long Island. And so parts of New York are much more like Massachusetts and Connecticut than other parts. But so they were really, heartfelt, big demonstrations. A few colonies then decided we're going to just boycott sugar. Not all of them did, but they're scattered boycotts. So the Sugar Act went nowhere. It caused all of these problems. It didn't raise any extra money. It didn't really, nobody actually was tried for smuggling. And so it was a failure, but they still need money. So they passed the Stamp Act. Everybody knows about the Stamp Act because it was so unpopular. This is the first direct tax. And Sugar Act, with taxing sugar, it's an indirect tax. You don't even, the tax is embedded in the price of the sugar. So the price of sugar went up a little bit. But if you don't want to pay it, don't buy sugar. It's not called out. The Stamp Act, Britain sends representatives to open offices in all the colonies where you have to go buy your stamps, and you have to put a stamp on every newspaper, pamphlets, broadsides, contracts, diplomas, everything that's a published product, almanacs, all legal documents have to have the stamp. Even playing cards, calendars, liquor licenses have to have the government stamp, and you have to go to the Britain's stamp officer, buy the stamp, and put it on. So it affects everybody. Really, you can't live without this. So the much more widespread demonstrations in the colonies. The only one which is really becomes quite violent is in Boston, of course, where a mob of about 3,000 people attacked first the stamp officer's office and demolished it. There's nothing left of that. And then they went to the royal lieutenant governor's house. And as you can see, this is an accurate picture of what happened. They didn't tear the house down. They broke all the windows. They destroyed all the furniture. They destroyed everything in the house. And then they took the lieutenant governor's, all of his papers, and threw them all over the streets of Boston. This got a lot of attention in Britain. And the house was uninhabitable. The royal lieutenant governor, then moved to Castle Island to a different house because you couldn't live there. So this is then right after the Stamp Act. This is a cartoon by Paul Revere. It's not all that sophisticated, but it's meant to show what was the attitude towards this stuff in the colonies. All those people on the left that are wielding the weapons are supposed to be the colonists, and it shows people from different colonies. Some of them have labels on them. One character label, they're from these places. And they're attacking the dragon, which is Parliament. Nobody likes blaming the king because that would be highly illegal. But they're attacking Parliament in the form of the dragon, who is inspired by a devil above his head. And he's rolling up the Magna Carta, which is meant to show he's totally destroying our rights from that. He wants to ignore them. And that's the stamp agent hanging from the Liberty Tree over on the right. And this sums up the attitude in the colonies towards the Stamp Act and what Britain is doing, especially the showing that Parliament is destroying the Magna Carta. So this is a British cartoon. This is Paul Revere reproduced it, but it was originally in the British papers and widely displayed throughout Britain. Okay, the two people in the middle, the one on the right is the Prime Minister, Grenville, and he's holding the scale, which is broken. It's lying on the ground because on one end is the debts. So on the ground is the debts which have broken the scale. What they have in money, it won't begin to cover it. The monkeys is people. It's meant to show that the parliamentarians, the lords and commons, members of parliament, are playing at governing, but they're represented by monkeys. On the right, that's Britannia, who's brokenhearted, and she's standing in front of debtor's prison. And on the left, the Indian woman they always use an Indian woman because they can't think of anything who they have less respect for than an Indian woman. That's America. And she's brought in a bag of dollars because that was required. She's wearing a yoke around her neck that says taxed without representation. I was unable to find a copy of the original, so that might have been added by Paul Revere. It's like, if you don't get it, this is the rest of the story. The man in the middle on the left is Lord North, and he is about to be replaced Grenville as prime minister. The king will move him into that position. And on the far left, one person is pilfering a little money, which is meant to show even in the worst situations, you have all this dishonesty, pilfering from the governor. In the far left, they're saying, why don't we just loot France? But somehow France doesn't have any money either because they actually lost the 7 Years' War. So ultimately, the Stamp Act was repealed because it had caused so much trouble and they weren't making any money from it anyway. But instead, just to show that you haven't really cowed us, the Parliament passes the Declaratory Act, which says only Parliament has the right to tax the colonies. You know, it's our right. We're repealing this act that you hated so much, but don't think that we can't do it because it's our right to do this. And this whole slogan, taxation without representation, it's a catchphrase all throughout the colonies. Everybody is saying this at this point, and they're livid. So this is a cartoon which was Benjamin Franklin at the time in 1767 is an envoy to London. And he has this particular cartoon produced. The girl in the middle is Britannia, and she's looking at her severed limbs. And this is a warning. If you lose those colonies, you are doomed. You need those colonies. So the legs and arms have actually been labeled with the names of colonies. And they were carrying an olive branch, but of course that's dropped to the ground. And Britannia has been forced to drop her shield and lance. She has no protection because she had to do this because she seems to have lost the colonies. The ships on the far right there are shown they're idle, and they have the upside down brooms on them, show that they're for sale. This is what will happen to your trade if you do this. And this banner that runs across the ocean and across Britannia says, this is a Latin motto, give a farthing to Belisario. Belisario, this is a myth that's known to every British schoolboy. Belisario was a famous Roman general, and he was falsely accused of a crime, and so he was blinded and left by the side of the road to beg. And this is a suggestion that what's happening on one side of the Atlantic, which is then moves to the other side, and what you're doing in the colonies will have this effect. You will lose those colonies. And it's Benjamin Franklin saying, you don't want to do this. So it's published in London, and he personally gives copies of this cartoon to all of the members of Parliament that he can find, all of the merchants, the shippers, everyone he can find. This is what you're risking. It didn't have any effect, of course, because Parliament was not in the mood to listen to this kind of thing. They had changed the government. Lord North now is the Prime Minister, and he brings in a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Townshend. And this is supposed to be, Townshend is really a sharp guy, and he knows how to handle the debt and what he can do. And Townshend then passes the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were one of the things, probably the thing, that threw the colonies over the edge. So the Revenue Act, they just introduce a new tax on a bunch of things that everybody needs. And they set up boards to enforce the laws against smuggling. The New York Restraining Act disbanded the local government in New York. And that was meant as an example, saying that Parliament can do this whenever they feel like it. So just because you live in Pennsylvania doesn't mean that we can't disband your government or any place you are. The one odd thing is this Indemnity Act that reduced the tax on tea. The East India Company was the second largest corporation in Britain, and they were in trouble not selling enough tea because there were widespread boycotts here and there against tea, and they had tea in the warehouses, which was rotting. And so this is an attempt, if we reduce the tax a little bit, probably those colonists will buy the tea. And then they added new crimes that have to be tried in royal courts. So you can't have a trial by a jury of your peers for these crimes. This is probably the thing that annoys people the most. This is another loss of a constitutional right on all of these things. So the response there were two major responses to the Townshend Acts. The first is that John Dickinson published letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. John Dickinson is actually a lawyer from Delaware, but who cares? This is an incredibly important publication because it explains in very, very clear, non-lawyerly language and it's directed at all of the colonists, why the British acts, what Britain is doing, is unconstitutional. You are losing your constitutional rights. It's published in pamphlets which are widely circulated in all of the colonies. And the result was that there are calls for boycotts of British goods, all British goods, that go out in all of the colonies. It's not especially well organized, but there are many, many more boycotts are coming up in various places, which will, in the local governments are deciding, we're going to boycott these, we'll boycott whatever was included in this. So they're a little bit disorganized, but they're very widespread. The other, in my view, even more response to this, the Massachusetts Circular Letter. Samuel Adams was, we always think of him, he makes beer. He's Harvard educated, a superb writer. And he publishes the circular letter. It's because it circulates to the speakers of all of the local colonial governments. And with a copy that goes to Britain's agent in the colonies, that it's to be sent to Parliament. And what it says is that boycotts are going to be the answer, but he uses the term, you have to harmonize. We need to start doing the same thing in order to have really a big effect on the British economy. So, and in speaking to the speakers of all of the local governments, it's your job to begin to harmonize these boycotts because this is the only thing which is actually going to get Britain's attention because it's going to affect the biggest companies in Britain. So the circular letter sparked a response in other colonies. They began to do the boycotts of everything. In Parliament, they decide, well, we can't punish all of the colonies because that's cutting off our nose to spite our faces. But we're going to punish Boston because they're the ones, that's where Samuel Adams lives, and we hate Samuel Adams. And so they decide to make an example of Boston. This is what we can do. They dissolve the Massachusetts legislature, and they land 4,000 British regulars in Boston who have to be accommodated in barns and empty houses and that kind of thing. Now, Boston is a city with a total population of 17,000. This means that every fourth person in Boston now is a British soldier. This is Paul Revere's print. Paul Revere, we all know he's a wonderful silversmith. He took a famous ride, but he's also a master propagandist. And whenever there's anything that will get a rise out of the colonial population, he prints an engraving and circulates it everywhere. And this shows 8 British, and he calls them ships of war, landing troops in Boston. Okay, with the consumer boycotts, women who are the main shoppers in the colonies all agree, they're going to boycott everything. They will not, the boycotts initially, the onus had been on the merchants. Now the onus is going to be for non-consumption. The onus is on the public. And the public, women especially decide, we can handle this. We'll use substitutes for sugar. We'll use substitutes for tea. We'll spin and weave and we'll repair our clothes. the Virginia legislature then produced a thing. It said, this was widespread throughout Virginia. Only the local legislature can tax the colonies. The royal governor, in response, then dissolved the Virginia legislature, and he left the country, went to England. And the other colonies now begin to worry. They can do this to anybody. Every colonial local government is worried about being dissolved at this. And the next year, in 1770, Parliament repealed the Townshend tax because, and the boycotts ended. That was what they wanted all along, is just repeal that awful Townshend Act. Meanwhile, though, there are still these 4,000 troops in Boston. They're everywhere. These are young men who are sent to this other city, and they don't have anything to do. A few of them go down and they get jobs at the port. They're working as stevedores. But most of them are just hanging out, and there are brawls everywhere. Boston is in itself, it's a rough place, and having soldiers, these young guys walking around, are a particular problem. And what starts as a bunch of these Bostonians who are giving one British soldier a hard time, then a group, and not nearly as many as Paul Revere pictured here, then line up, and it becomes they begin a snowball fight. And it's called a snowball fight, but many of the snowballs are really ice balls, or they have a stone inside the snow. So it becomes very unpleasant, and somebody during this yells fire. Nobody knows, who it was, and it may have been a British soldier or it might have just been a person on the street. But they shoot, and it wounded several Bostonians, and it killed 5 of them, including Crispus Attucks, who is a free African American. He's a dock worker, and he's killed on the spot. But there's a lot of free African Americans in Boston, and that hits home. The killing people, on the streets of Boston hits home. And this was Paul Revere's most popular print. It sold like wildfire everywhere in the colonies, and he could have called it, some British soldiers fire on Bostonians. He called it the Bloody Massacre because he is a propagandist. In response, Massachusetts had, from 1764, had these committees of correspondence, which were essentially a communications network where, it's broad, and that it's also very deep. So these are committees who are designed to pick up the news and make sure that everybody gets it. It's passed along to everybody across this wide network and down to people living in rural areas, to everybody. And in response to what was happening with the Townshend Act and the Boston Massacre, then all of the colonies begin these committees of correspondence. By 1773, every colony had these committees of correspondence, who are men who are just, sometimes they publish the information, sometimes they put it in private letters, sometimes they meet in person to send the information, and sometimes if they feel like this is a little bit dangerous, they will send a private courier by horseback to notify other people of what's happening. And by the fall of 1773, these committees of correspondence were everywhere in Maryland. And they had expanded so that they were in touch with all of the colonies. So I need to speed this up. Okay, so the East India Company I had mentioned was the second largest company in Boston. They were loaded with tea and going out of business. So Parliament said, we're going to make a special law. It had always been required that the company was required to auction off its tea to merchants who would then ship it in their own ships and sell it to merchants in the colonies. They changed the rule and said you can sell it directly. The East India Company has plenty of ships, so they ship loads of tea to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And in Boston, we know what happened. The Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians, they rode out and they took all of the tea, which I've listed how much it was worth, and dumped it in the harbor. Others then, still dressed as Indians, came out in canoes and to make sure that it sank. This, of course, created enormous problems for Boston in Britain, and they passed these new things, the Boston Port Act, which said, we will, in other colonies, they didn't dump the tea, but they wouldn't let the ships into the port. In some places, they had little ceremonies where they burned existing tea on the town green. The blockade of Boston would only allow food for British soldiers. Nothing could go in or out of Boston, which meant they're stuck for food. Bostonians are fishermen. So this is a picture. On the left, you can see what the big problem is. And Boston is much more like an island that's connected by a narrow causeway to the mainland. And it's the way they get everything, food, fuel, everything else has to come in from the harbor, and it's blockaded. The picture on the right is a British cartoon of what's happening, and it represents what really went on. Boston, they hang the cage from the Liberty Tree, they brought it on themselves. These are colonists from other colonies who are feeding the Bostonians and giving them food, something to drink. So Connecticut sent livestock. Pennsylvania sent grain to Boston. South Carolina sent hundreds of bushels of rice. Georgia, North Carolina, Maryland, New Hampshire, and other New England towns, other Massachusetts towns, sent money to Boston to try to get, so they could buy food and send it on that narrow causeway. And North Carolina, the legislature passed a resolution, quote, the cause of Boston is the common cause of the American colonies. This is the first time that they start saying, these are Americans, take care of them. Okay, so the Maryland counties, Maryland was the first colony that responded. And the 10 men that I mentioned at the beginning were part of this. The Maryland colonies signed these resolutions, and they're almost all exactly alike. And they begin with this line, the town of Boston is suffering in the common cause of all America. And they do this in all of the colonies, they're signing these things. This is a copy of the Hungerford Resolves. It was published in the same issue of the Maryland Gazette as a couple of other colonies, in fact, a couple of other counties, including a couple from Virginia. But they're worded the same way. Okay. So that first act, which blockaded the harbor, also became part of what Britain called the coercive acts and Americans called the intolerable acts. They dissolved the government in Massachusetts, appointed by the Crown. The governor, appointed everybody. Forget those selectmen, and there are no trials by jury. Everything has to go to a British court, and the troops have to be housed in Boston. In Maryland, the Annapolis Convention began, and this became the government of Maryland for the next several years. The royal governor took off and went back to England. Maryland joined the other colonies to, in the boycotts, but they also elected the delegates to the First Continental Congress. None of our Montgomery guys were part of those delegates because they were big fish in a small pond. The delegates were people like William Paca, Charles Carrollton. So the Congress met then in Philadelphia in September, and the only person who was even suggesting maybe this could lead to war was Samuel Adams, and his cousin John Adams kept saying, forget that, don't even try to bring that up. Nobody wants war. They just want to get rid of all these horrible acts that, and they want to change what's going on in Boston. But they decided at this they would boycott everything. The boycotts would start immediately, and then they would meet again in 6 months. The colonies themselves responded, the non-consumption committees in various places, women in various places then signed these agreements. We are not going to buy anything. The enforcement acts, in various colonies said, we will publish the names of people who violate these boycotts by buying anything. They publish them in the newspapers to see them published or punished by their neighbors. So all this time, Samuel Adams and John Hancock had been collecting weapons and ammunition and storing it in secret in Concord. And by this time, smuggling is rampant in Boston, but so is spying. And so the British, this was totally secret. The British knew everything about it. And so Paul Revere, who was part of the spy network, knew that the British knew. And so the plan was that he knew exactly that the British are going to come on April 19th. So he does this famous ride. He has two companions to ride out through the whole countryside, warning people. And by the time the British are there, the Minutemen have already assembled on Lexington Green. Everybody knows they're coming, and the militias have assembled. And this, what Ralph Waldo Emerson called the shot heard around the world, was fired on this little bridge, the Old North Bridge in Concord. Emerson's grandmother and all of his aunts and uncles watched the battle from there with the old manse, was where his grandfather was the congregational minister for Concord. He fought in the battle, but the whole family then watched this because they lived right next door. Anyway, so, and we know what happened at Concord and Lexington. After the battles, the British killed more colonists than they suffered. However, the militias harassed them all the way back into Boston. And once the British were in Boston, the siege of Boston began by the militia encircled the whole city, so the British couldn't get out. This caused terrible shortages of food and fuel for the British soldiers there, which was the intent. When George Washington took control of the army, he settled in Cambridge, and then the colonial army, the Continental Army circled Boston as part of the way to keep the British not supplied with what they needed to stay there. So a month after Concord and Lexington, the Second Continental Congress met to see how successful were those boycotts. Only everything has changed, and so they declared war at this particular thing. They sent diplomats to especially Paris, but also Holland, looking for loans because they knew a war is going to cost a lot of money. They increased the militias, hoping to create a continental army. On June 19th, then the Congress made George Washington, then put him in charge of the entire creating a continental army. On January 10th, 1776 now, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, which made a lot of arguments about this. He's very, very articulate and very quotable. And there are two things that stand out. One is the illogic of any kind of hereditary monarchy. This is foolishness. It was never meant to be. And the second is we should declare what he called independency. It's not enough for them to change the rules. We need to be an independent country. And he says, we have it in our power to begin the world over. One of the readers who was very, very much influenced, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, all of these people were. Thomas Jefferson mentioned that he had read this and it's had an enormous impact on him. And so on July 4th, then they read the Declaration aloud for everybody. And that's the big thing we're celebrating. And this was John Adams's remark about what had happened. As these people became Americans, they're no longer concerned with being Englishmen, they're Americans. And he calls this 13 clocks were made to strike us together. And that's it. I'm sorry it ran over, but I love this
It was
stuff.
fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. We have a minute or two for questions if anybody wants to ask. Sandra, any questions?
Yeah.
Yep.
Where was the silver from that they minted, and that each colony mint its own coinage?
I missed the first part of your question.
Where was the silver from that they minted, and did each colony mint its own coinage?
No, none of them minted their own coins. They printed their own paper currency, but they used the British coinage, or some of it was Spanish coinage that was left around. But it had value, and that's the only thing that people could trust as they went from one colony to another. But they had plenty of paper.
So they got their silver from Britain or Spain or wherever.
And they did,
and had its own value. Yeah.
Right, and they got the coinage. Yes.
Hi, I'm wondering to what extent there was a population of people in the colonies who were not British subjects, and whether they considered themselves British before we declared independence, or whether they were considered citizens or subjects of other countries.
They gave up that notion. The largest number who were not British, the largest number who were not British subjects, other than the Native Americans, who never fell for any of this, were people who had come. They were immigrants from European countries in Pennsylvania, and they became. There was no formal way to become an American citizen. They considered themselves British citizens because they were governed by British law as well as the local laws. And when after independence, they continued to be covered by British law because we didn't have a constitution yet. But one of the biggest things that loyalists were worried about, and there were a lot of loyalists, was what will happen if we win? Will there be any law? Will we descend into anarchy? And that was one of them. Some people just felt like, we took a vow of allegiance to the king, or we're proud to be Englishmen. But most of them were just worried, what will happen after this if we win? So there was nobody claiming Dutch citizenship or German citizenship or French citizenship. When a bunch of Frenchmen came, and they were simply loyal to George Washington. Yes.
When the Adams collected the weapons, were they trying to provoke war?
Samuel Adams would have. That's why Samuel Adams never had any money, but his best friend is John Hancock, and he has unlimited money. And so they were not necessarily trying to provoke war, but they thought it was inevitable, and they were going to be ready. And when Samuel Adams and John Hancock went to the First Continental Congress, he did want to present a proposal to be voted on that we declare war. And his cousin absolutely told him not to. This is the worst thing that you can do. And so he didn't.